Hi everybody, welcome back. We're now looking at the mixing basics with compression. And of course, we've got nothing, with all of these lectures and everything unless of course we use them. And so I just kind of want to show you some techniques on what we can do to use these and hopefully utilize them in a very professional way and get the push and pull and frequency balance that you've all, hopefully read about and wanted to achieve for yourself. It's very, very easy. So as you saw in the lectures before, we were looking at VCA compressors, and in our case, we were looking at the SSL channel emulation, but you can also find them in API. You can find them in Rupert Neve designs. I'll show you some here at the house in the next couple videos that I'll be sending out. Many of us love them for the predictability and repeatability. They're very clean and very transparent, and that's a big one of what we'll talk about here today. So you see them oftentimes on a master bus, and that's in the sense of what we'll be dealing with in the next let's just say 2 days or 2 lectures. We'll be talking about what we could do with the limiter, or what we could do on the actual master bus, controlling everything, maybe potentially getting a really, really nice overall balance and achieving a really nice glue, for example. We could also look at groups of instruments, and that's something that we haven't talked about is subgrouping, and that's something that I'll show you here shortly. And then also on guitars, basses, and drums, VCAs are great. I use them for warmth. I love them. They really, they create a nice warm sound. They add a little touch of bass, in my own opinion. So I think that they're wonderful for anything that you're trying to, let's just say, warm up a little bit and bring out a touch. But at the same time, they're very, very clean. Optical compressors. These are also really wonderful and very smooth and quite musical, as you could see here. Great for vocals, lead lines, other elements that need the rounding out. You wouldn't call it a hard squash, but we call it nice warm evening out, in the sense of just think of being able to have a really nice pristine vocal. I really love it too because it takes away some of the picks of certain things. And so if something sounds like it's a little bit too bright, this actual compressor, if we use it properly, will actually tame some of that. I think you'll love it. I'll show you exactly how that works as well. And then FET. FET I look at as for aggression. And so maybe potentially if we have some guitars, there are certain vocalists that love using FET because they want their vocals to sound very aggressive and very, very famous. I've got a couple of them myself. I absolutely love them and I use them almost every day. At the same time, we're very lucky because we get to simulate them here, and I think you'll find that they're also wonderful. And the setback, of course, is that you probably wouldn't want to use this on a mix bus or for a master because of the simple fact it's very aggressive. It adds a lot of color, and so I don't know if you want that much distortion necessarily on everything, but wonderful for guitars and for vocals, for drums. Really, really cool. And I'll show you some ideas here as we start mixing. So here are the mix techniques that you had in the last lesson. Now, of course, if you're anything like me, it means nothing unless I look at this musically. And so what I've done is I've called up the track that we had before, Arise, and those are the stems that I had sent you, and maybe potentially some of you actually have them. So if you want to roll through, feel free to copy what I've got here, and you'll find that this will work not necessarily for just these tracks, but for any tracks that you use this. The transparency I think you're going to find is, at least it's been for me, it's been a magic trick. It's really a huge part of my business. So the first things first is we're going to set a nice ratio, 2 to 4 to 1. We don't want to get too aggressive. We want to shut off all of the audio controls. Then we're going to take our threshold and we're going to be fairly aggressive when we start, and we're going to take about 10 to 20 dB. What you find is that when we call up the actual compressor in Logic, and I'll show you here in a minute, it starts with 20 dB back. So you can just leave it there and then we can start seeing what's going on. So we'll be a little aggressive at first, of course, and then we're just going to inch it back. Once we've got that set on our threshold, we adjust the attack time, and we'll be very subtle about that. And of course, adjusting the release time, because in this particular case, we're dealing with acoustic instruments. We'll then raise the threshold, turning it closer to 0 so that it's much more transparent, of course. And then I'll show you how that works. And then we'll add the makeup gain and rebalance the instrument to the mix. It's very, very simple. And let me just roll through that, very quickly. And as we roll through over and over, I think that you'll find it's really, really simple. And so before we get started, let me just go through one aspect of what we've got here then. The lab compression technique. In a perfect world, of course, you'd have these stems. We'll send you these stems. You'll upload them, of course, in the lab, and then we'll go through these. Now, if you remember back, we actually, in the other EQ lecture, we were talking about being able to add EQ and cutting everything, of course, and then later what we would do is add the color with our, vintage EQ. In this case, though, before we get to that vintage EQ, we're going to pop that compressor right in the middle. So I'll show you how that works. It's really, really simple. So first things first, just like what we did, and I've got the fast pass for you, we filtered out all of the EQ just like what we talked about before. So I'm just hitting Command 2 to get to my mixer, and that's the EQ that we filtered out with that linear EQ. You all did that with me, right? Now on top of that, we did the vintage EQ, but with that channel EQ, what I want to do is I'm going to set up that compressor first. And so in this case, let's just take that out. And we're going to balance, we're going to pan the tracks. And so that's something that we hadn't really talked about, but the overheads, things like that, we may want to, balance these out. So I've got my hi-hat balanced out a little bit. I'm going to take the electric guitars and we'll get those panned just a touch. Now, of course, in a perfect world, we're going to listen to this, obviously. But as we roll through, we're just looking for a nice balance. I'm looking at, keeping the mids in the middle and the lows in the middle. And then, of course, anything that's going to be transient within the highs, of course, is anything that's going to be standing out as far as our guitar parts. I want those to maybe potentially have our side balance on that side. So like in this case, my highs of my organ will be off to the left side. And you can see how I've balanced my guitars. And they're separated out as well a little bit. The piano, the same thing. I want that balanced out just a little bit. And then I'm going to set this as the actual track, as you can see here. The piano part, it comes in at certain sections, and so I'll just have that coming from that same area. And the vocals in that sense, then I'm just going to keep that lead vocal, and I'm going to leave that lead vocal in the middle. And then the others I'll just kind of just put off to the side, just a little bit, but they're still kind of taking the center. So most importantly, my vocals owning the center. My bass frequencies are owning the center. My kick drums, my basses are in the center. I've panned off the hi-hat a little bit. I kept my snares centered. My electric guitars in the mid-range and some of the more prominent aspects of the actual tracks themselves, I've got those panned off from the middle. And I've got the organ panned off from the middle. I've got the piano part panned off from the middle. So hopefully in this case, just very quickly, we've just achieved, a nice stage balance. But the most important part that I'm looking at here is that imagine that if I'm looking at these instruments up on a stage, where would I see them? And then how would I have them balanced up on that stage as I'm looking at it? And that's a really good way to think about panning something out. And again, most importantly, if you're taking anything from me, there are no rules. This is just creating some type of a subtle separation. So balancing and panning the tracks, very, very simple to do. Now, when we're talking about balancing, of course, we're talking about coming in and doing the amplitude, turning things up and or down. So that will also be something that we'll want to put, a substantial amount of time into. Now we're getting into the compression of each. So as we just talked about what we talked about, as I go over this and over this, as you can see, it's going to make a lot of sense because I'm going to be doing the same things for each track as we get into them. But we're going to be having a thought process that hopefully we can tap into in terms of the usage of what we would be doing if we had these in our hands in a tangible format. So obviously all of these compressors that we're dealing with, these are simulated, of course, but they actually exist. So let's look at exactly what we could do, and I think you'll find it's very, very simple. So first and foremost, using the techniques that were explained above, of course, and you've got that set. Now let's get the compression. As we've got the compression set, we'll turn off all auto gain, auto release. We're lowering that threshold, of course, so we've got that set and we can hear what's happening with the compressor. We'll make all of our adjustments. Most importantly, then, we set our distortion level to soft and we pick the compressor that we would like. At that point, we're going to be basically hearing everything the way that we want to hear it. So enough of what we were talking, and let's actually start doing. Check it out. First and foremost, I'm just going to start soloing things out. So here's my kick drum. So as the kick drum rolls through, I've called up a compressor again in my dynamics. So as I call up that compressor, you'll see here, the one that they gave us is the Platinum Digital. That's the cleanest one that they have. Now let's go back to what we were just talking about. Let's shut off the auto gain of everything. You see how I'm shutting off the auto gain of the envelope and I'm shutting off auto gain of our makeup, right? So then let's make sure that our distortion is set to soft so we can actually hear exactly what we're doing. And remember, this is a kick drum. So on the kick drum, we probably want to warm that up a little bit because it's low frequencies. And so I would look at some of these VCAs, right? So what I'm going to do for the kick drum, I'm going to use this SSL. So we've got our threshold set. It's automatically comes up to -20. So it should be fairly aggressive so we can start kind of hearing what's going on with that kick. And check it out. And I'll go quick too. You can see it really pushing. So I'm going to adjust my attack and my release points. So all I did was tighten the attack and I opened the release just a little bit, nothing to it. And as I open the threshold up closer to 0, you see how the needle's moving just a touch. Now we're very transparent, we're hardly using it at all. But if I bypass, we've achieved a nice balance. We've added a little bit of warmth, a little more low end, and a touch of punch. And that's what we want for a kick drum, right? So again, same thing, distortion set to soft. We shut off everything as far as automatically giving us any help. And we were very cautious about how we adjust, our threshold and also our ratio. So as you can see here, I'm 3.5 to, in this case, the threshold -4.5. Very, very close to 0. Hardly using it, but at the same time, it really does add a lot. So let's look at what we could do here to our snare. Let's do the same thing. I'll just keep rolling through and I'll just keep going very quickly. Now, something that I might want to do with this particular snare is I might want to be a little bit more aggressive. And so to make it a little more aggressive, I'm going to use FET. So now I've got a nice aggressive snare, all based on utilizing the algorithm of the 1176. I've got the threshold very close to 0, the ratio set to 2 to 1, makeup hardly changed at all basically, but the most important part is I'm using this compressor because I've got the distortion set to soft, so it sounds as if this FET is giving the snare just a push, making it a little bit more aggressive, not much more of course, right? I'll keep going. I've got just a little bit here on the hi-hat. And there we have it. I just used the classic VCA, the hi-hat being, very high-pitched, of course, and so I just wanted to tame some of those frequencies down. So using the VCA to warm it up just a little bit, this is that DBX. Just a touch of the threshold, keeping it very close to 2 to 1. I turn the makeup down just a little bit, of course, and then, using that algorithm of its output, it just kind of warms it up just a little bit on the output of the hi-hat. The overheads, I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I could just drag that over, basically, right? And then let's just customize the controls. Okay, now we'll just keep going here. For the sake of time, I'm going to start with our basses in this particular case. The basses we certainly want to warm up, right? Maybe to make that really stand out, what we could do is warm that up with one that we hadn't used up to this point. So I'm going to warm this one up with that red. And so in this case now, let's shut the auto gain off. Put our distortion set to soft, and I'm going to set that release and open that all the way up, and then have a nice short attack. Keep our ratio, close to like how we had the kick drum. Let's see what we got here. Now, we really lose the bass if we've got this threshold set too far back, so we have to make sure that we've got that set right, of course, in that sense. We can start really getting it back once I start inching that closer to 0. So be very careful on that bass side, especially when it comes to synth bass, in this case being reggae, of course, is very bass heavy too. Of course, those sub-octaves can get a little bit crazy, and just taking off just a touch is a really good thing for the bass. If I was to analyze the graph, you'll see. So as you can see here, I'm just taking just a touch right off the bass here, not much to it, just a little bit. We take too much, of course, we got ourselves problems. So let's inch our bass back up so we're a little bit closer to that threshold at 0. And we'll get a much, much better bass tone, of course, right? So as we keep continuing on, the guitars we want to be a little bit more aggressive, right? So we could start looking at those guitars as FET. And we've got several choices. We've got vintage FET, we've also got the 1176. I suggest using both of them, and so in this case maybe potentially having one of the guitars with one set of FET and then the other guitar using the vintage FET. It's totally up to you. There are no rules, but I think that it's really wise to start looking at pushing and pulling. And so as I've just added these 4 guitars now, basically, let's just do this here. I'm going to take the first guitar and I'm going to have this shut off nice and easy, basically, right? Set our distortion set to soft. Let's go back to the next one, and let's just do the opposite, where we will use the vintage FET and do the similar controls, of course. Set our threshold, get that set. Of course, we're going to be listening to this to make sure that it's perfect. Shut off everything so that it's not automatically on, of course. Let's make sure I did that on the last one. Yes. And continuing on, let's use the same for the third and the same for the fourth. And so then that third one we've got now 1176, and the fourth guitar, excuse me, we will also have the FET. So now, we have ourselves 4 guitars using each one an 1176. So let me just kind of get these going in tandem. And there's number 1 guitar, number 2 guitar, and we'll do number 3 here in a minute. Check it out. Let's get the as you can see here, we're hardly compressing at all. All we're really doing is just using this for tonality, and it really sounds beautiful. You can see our third guitar really sticking out, and the bottom line is we had our controls off. And so now we've got everything set. There we have it. Our guitars are really, really working together nicely. We've just taken just a little bit off in terms of our compression, but at the same time adding a lot of tonality because of the compressors that we've picked. So on top of that, of course, we've got access to our organs. And so I've got the high frequency organ. So we might want to compress that in a very different way, right? The high frequency organ maybe potentially being FET on the highs. And so in this case, I might just come in this side, huh? Okay, open the release on that one. Good to go. And on the lows, we might want to warm that up. For example, on your VCA. So I'm just going to take maybe one of our classic VCAs here, or match it to the bass, and that's going to be the organ lows. Same idea, shutting everything off just like what we've done before, so nothing's automatic. Making sure our distortion is set to soft. Let's listen to what happens to our organs now with the entire balance of everything. Seems to be working pretty well, right? Now, pianos, same thing. Looking at pianos being, high to mid-range in that side. So we might want to bring those out just a little bit as well. So I'm going to be looking at this one, and in this case, we haven't used this vintage Opto yet. So it might be a good opportunity to check that out. It'll definitely bring that piano part out for sure. And so we'll keep that nice and consistent. So I'll use exactly the same control. All I'm doing is just option dragging, nothing to it. So in this case, let's just start trying to adjust our pianos. Now, I'm going to get back to where that piano part was starting here. We should be good to go. There we have it. Shutting off all the automatic controls. Just a touch in terms of the envelope, not much to it, of course. Opening the release just a little bit and taking a little bit off of the attack. The threshold's very close to 0, ratio at 3, makeup set, a little bit lower than 0. Distortion on soft. You can't go wrong. And so as you can see here, that was the piano 2. So what I'll do then is then take that piano 2 and then just drag that piano 2 back over to piano 1. And we should have really nice piano parts now. And we do. Now, we're getting to our vocals, and again, the same thing too is I don't want to oversimplify this. Of course, we should, roll through this and really brood over exactly what we're, checking out and listening to. But, take it from me. I think that you'll find, obviously, in this particular case, we're looking at this listening through built-in, and it's really hard to hear the idiosyncrasies of everything, or at least it's really hard to hear the differences and the nuances of everything. But if you take it, from me, I think what you'll find is that, you know, if we subtly use these compressors and we start thinking about the idea that these are actually tangible pieces of gear, I think you'll find that they all work very, very well when we create this balance. And as you can see here, this is very simple. It's a frequency balance. So let me continue on here with our vocals. Very quickly then, I'm going to take this compressor and I want these guys, I'm going to set the vocals, the background vocals set to Platinum Digital. This is Logic's algorithm, right? Now, as far as distortion set to soft, obviously being that this isn't an actual device that exists, it's just going to warm it up just a little bit, of course. I'll open the release just a little bit. And let me just, for the sake of time, utilize that same vocal compression, at least on these guys, with exception to the background. Or, excuse me, with exception to the lead. So as far as my lead here, my lead is being set here on 21. I'm going to take the lead and I'm going to use a very different compressor than all the others. And so in this case then, instead of using Platinum Digital for the lead, I'm going to use the Vintage Opto. And we'll shut off our auto gain. Now this is the one that hopefully, because it's the only one on the vocals that we're using, it should make that lead vocal stand out a little bit. Now, let me unsolo all of these. Now we should be able to listen to the entire track. So as you can see here, I've got everything soloed. So essentially I could pretty much just shut them all off if we wanted to, of course, right? So let's just do that. Now very quickly too, I'm going to need to adjust our vocals. And so we've got quite a few of them we've just taken care of. So let me just make sure we've got these set. I'll do it really quickly here. Second background vocal, same thing. Let's just turn that down just a touch. I'm just looking to just try to be very subtle about it, of course, but making sure that we're using it properly. Good. See here, I'm just really kind of just turning it down. Should be good there. And for the sake of depth, I'm going to change out the control to Vintage on the vocal 20 here, and then I'm also going to do the same thing on the background vocal 22. I'll change that also to Vintage. Now let's go to our lead here, and as we listen to this, we're going to listen to trying to bring that lead out. And let's see what we got here. Vocals only, right?
Run, 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 Babylon Nabucco. Run, 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 Babylon Nabucco. Run, 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 him run, wicked man a go wrong. Run, 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 him run, Babylon a go gone. Babylon, Babylon, Babylon a go gone. Ooh, Babylon is coming to take it away. So you better run, 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 Babylon a go gone.
Not bad, right? All we've really done, we've taken each compressor, starting all the way back to the kick drum, and we've done exactly the same thing within our notes. So just to review, looking back at what you've just done. We used auto gain, we shut it all off. We shut off the auto release button. We lowered that threshold so that it was closer and closer to 0, so that we're just taking just a little bit off. We adjust the makeup gain. We set our distortion levels to soft. And we used the emulation that was closest to the actual track that we were working with, of course. Most importantly, that was our way that we started. Slowly, looking at a ratio, adjusting it to 2 to 4 to 1, looking at our auto controls and making sure that all of that is shut off. We're just, going through each individual one, just, like I say, just very slowly making sure that each one is set properly. And I think that you'd find that it was really easy to do, and we really achieved a wonderful balance on that particular mix. And I think that you'll find it's not just for these tracks. I think that you'll find that all tracks will work just as easily. It's really quite simple. So the same idea is that the one thing that we're missing now is that if we were to continue on in this particular exercise, you may want to add your color at the end. So if you remember when we went through and we talked about our vintage EQ, and we went and we added, let's say, for example, the Neve EQ if we wanted to, or if we went through some of these and we did, decided that we wanted to add something that, was a little bit different or a little bit more aggressive, we could have done that, right? So it's all here essentially. And so we can add our color later if we wanted to. So let's say, for example, going back to the actual lectures that we had before, if you wanted to change your vintage out, we easily could. And if I wanted to, I could change it out to the tubes. I could change it out to the API again, but really this is the EQ side of it. And so as you can see here, without even getting into that stage of it, we've really got something here.
Say the wicked man now come. Babylon come. You better run.
That's just cutting and compression after that. We haven't even added the color after. So I think what you'll find is that if you utilize these very simple tricks, and like I was saying to you here before as we go back to what we had our notes, compressing each track, picking the proper emulation, that's the point that we're at right now. We've got a really wonderful balance. Now we can rebalance the tracks, so we would go back, hopefully, just adjusting it. As you could see, I was kind of doing that little by little as we were going. I'm just kind of adjusting things, re-leveling things a little bit here and there, maybe potentially helping the panning just a touch, but we'd rebalance just a little bit. Then we add our vintage EQ plugins for added timbre and color. So just like I was telling you, add that if you decide that that's what you want to do. It could be anything. It could be the tube EQ if you wanted to. It could be that Neve EQ if you wanted, or it could be that API if you wanted it to be very, very aggressive, right? It's all up to you. It's all here, and the choices that you've got can really, really make a very professional balance. Take it from me. Surprisingly, this is all built in Logic, and at the same token, don't feel that you can't make a great mix if you've got a separate DAW. What you'll find, of course, is that you'll see that maybe potentially you might start thinking about adding some third-party compressors and some of those ideas and things that you've studied here. Potentially you could bring into your mixes in the future with some of the third-party plugins from companies like Universal Audio or Plugin Alliance. I really hope this helps. Most importantly, please let me know if you have any questions, if you need anything. And most importantly, always remember that if there's a track that you're most happy with, any of my students, I'm always happy to mix and master any of your stuff. You let me know, okay? Take care, everybody.